You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. A very good day to everybody listening in to episode number 12 of Brobears Talk. And today we are going to be talking about the Electoral College, the crazy state of political affairs in the United States, and the election looming in less than a week away. Brother Bear, are you excited?
Brother Bear, I cannot wait. I think it's a fantastic insight. You're our man in North America over there, and a bit closer to the action, of course. Damien there in Denver. He's been seeing the Biden banners, the Trump banners. It's all about to kick off. Very exciting, very relevant. Can't wait to get stuck in.
Brilliant. I love the enthusiasm. And over here, yes, I can be your Canadian correspondent. There's a lot of support for both Trump and Biden here in Alberta. And we're also going to be talking a heck of a lot today about the cyclical nature of politics and how there always seems to be a level of duality in the way the US elections are run.
The time of the Ouroboros has arrived. Is that what you're saying, Leo?
It has. Perhaps the Ouroboros has arrived. I don't know. I think that I think we're now at, we're 7 days from the most powerful country on earth deciding its next leader. Who is it going to put in the White House? And I think everyone's not again really, because people were so convinced that Trump wouldn't win last time. But I think at this juncture in time, no one really knows or can accurately predict what's going to happen. Do you have any knowledge or foresight that you can impart to myself and the listeners, Brother Bear, on who you think might snatch the victory this time?
Brotherly Bear. Well, I think if the last elections taught us anything, is that the polls can often be quite misleading right until sort of election night even. Because I don't remember if I followed it live, Leo, but there was a heavy leaning towards Hillary winning the election in 2016, is that right? And that sort of persisted throughout the night, and then it gradually, as the states came in and the results came in, that big pendulum began to swing in Trump's favour. But it was only in the very late stages of that evening.
Yeah, that's right. I remember actually following the polls and all the betting agencies, and they were giving Hillary a huge lead. A lot of them were predicting 80% win.
It was a landslide, basically, they were predicting, right?
It was one of the biggest landslides. It would have been one of the biggest landslides in US history. And I think everyone was just so shocked at the outcome when it was completely different. And as you said, even on the night, people were predicting, and the exit polls were predicting a firm Hillary win. But what happened in the end around 3 a.m. UK time, it was, I think when Trump won Florida, it was kind of a watershed moment, and it was just evident that it wasn't going to be that way.
Yeah. And I think it may well be the case this time around. I'm not sure which way it's going to go. I'm not sure there's a particularly strong evidence to sort of lean me one way or the other. What I will say is I spoke to Damien, who's our man in America, and he did say he's seeing a lot of Biden signs out there in the countryside, so out in the rural areas where you'd normally be more inclined to see more Republican support. He's actually seeing a lot of Biden signs, and that's just sort of I suppose circumstantial maybe evidence, and a relatively small sample, and no way represents the United States, maybe just a very small portion of Denver. But nonetheless, it was an interesting dynamic. He's maybe witnessing the maybe this is just the people and how democracy works. It is quite a frustrating thing that, have you ever actually come out of, or I suppose as a UK voter, come out of a Labour or a Conservative or a Lib Dem government in history where people haven't been dissatisfied with the last 4 years of work they've been doing and what's been implemented? Has there ever been a case of where people have been like, wow, that was great, let's have another 4 years of that? Maybe Obama, but apart from that, nothing else in living memory comes to mind. And it's such a weird thing, and then you swing from left to right to left. and it's it's rarely the case that the peoples of a country are completely satisfied and being like, yep, let's do another top up of that, do another 4-year plan.
Yeah, let's renew our contract again. It's interesting because elections are all about swing voters, and that's what politicians do on the campaign trail. They're not interested in reaching their own base. They're interested in reaching the people that are undecided. Those are the real people that decide elections. It's not people who are swing states or just swing people. Labour, if we're taking it back to the UK, isn't interested in reaching the heartland Labour supporters, and the same goes for Tories. They reach out to those areas that are on the fence, because that's what decides elections. But I think it comes back to, you called it an Ouroboros, and I think politics is a very cyclical chain of events, based on how long you can put up with a certain administration. But coming back to what you said about what Damien's observations were in Colorado, looking at the focus groups, which are actually a lot more telling now in terms of a temperature check on where politics is. The national polls obviously show that Mr. Biden has a significant advantage, but in the focus groups, white seniors in particular have showing signs of disapproval towards Trump. And this is a group that helped propel him to victory back in 2016.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. So would that be atypical of what you'd expect in America?
Very atypical. And the Republicans have definitely done well in the US, across the US, because white older people always come out to vote. Their turnout rates are very high. I think their president's handling of the pandemic has set them to maybe pulling that Democrat lever instead. And the reason why is obviously because they're the more vulnerable, or the most vulnerable group in society.
No, that
anyone senior.
Yeah, that does make some sense. I suppose there's always a level of indecision and sort of being on the fence right up until election night, as we saw in the 2016 election. But I think what I've noticed is that the candidates themselves are far from ideal. Obviously, there's no such thing as sort of the ideal candidate that sort of only exists in the imagination of potential voters, and everyone has a slightly different picture of what that looks like. But I don't think this particular election offers particularly, I suppose, options that fill you with confidence in terms of both competence and just longevity and energy required for the job at hand, right? They're in their late 70s, both of them, if I'm not wrong. And it's strange that we don't have better candidates, younger candidates, something more akin to Obama, that would have the necessary energy. Also because, energy is key to the job at hand, right? To be there on the international stage and projecting a strong America globally.
Yeah, I think you would assume, based off of logic and common sense, that being the leader of the world's superpower, the largest superpower in the world, would require longevity and energy and enthusiasm. I think just in general, both candidates aren't particularly desirable. We have obviously Trump with all his faults, and for better or for worse, and then Biden, who is a traditionally establishment politician. He comes from a legal background with time as a vice president and time as a Delaware senator since the late 70s. He's led a lot of interesting initiatives in narcotics reform in the United States, and has been involved in a bunch of different, really, I wouldn't say disputes, but certain groups and initiatives that have led to racial reform and things like that. So racial policy reform. So he's more of a sort of well-hardened politician. The question is, in America, is that anti-career politician, anti-establishment feeling, is it rampant enough in November 2020 to get Mr. Trump elected again?
Right, because I think it would be the anti-establishment vote they'd need to go for. Maybe that's why Bernie wasn't the preferred candidate from the Democrats' side, because he was also the anti-establishment, and there might be sort of a clash there between him and Trump.
Mm.
But, I mean, Bernie is sort of out of the Democrat candidates that were initially put forward. There was Andrew Yang, who I thought was a strong candidate, along with Bernie. Sort of that, I was sort of hoping those two to be the last two to go forward. But I suppose it's often the case that the pragmatic approach is the one taken, and it's not always the best candidate that gets put forward.
No, that's right. I mean, both of those both of those candidates, Yang and Sanders, were very anti-establishment and were rather unorthodox in their own way. And I think, you know, a lot of the time, these groups, particularly the DNC, they want the party or the candidate that will please the most individuals, sort of having a utilitarian approach to the election. And I think in many ways that can work in their favor, or it can swing the other way. Again, it all depends on how strong and widespread anti-establishment rhetoric is.
And did you get the chance to watch any of the two debates that were had between Biden and Trump?
I did, yeah. So I watched a little bit of the first, as much as I could stand, which wasn't very much, to be honest. It was just absolutely atrocious. I mean, did you get a chance to see the first edition?
I've not seen either full length. I've seen clips from both. But yes, the sense I got from the first was it was incredibly disorganized. I felt very sorry for the adjudicator man. He seemed to be struggling to keep either side sort of quiet to listen to the other person's answer. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a mess. The second one went a little way to salvage the remnants of the first debate. I thought there was less interruption and it was interesting to listen to, although for some reason, and I wasn't expecting this, I felt Trump came across a little more eloquent and actually articulated his ideas a little better, which is quite sort of gives you an idea of how badly I thought Biden came across from that. He was sort of saying, "Come on, man, come on, oh come on, you're the worst president the United States has never seen. Come on." I think "common" is probably just a filler term when he's unable to find the right words, and this probably speaks to some of the cognitive decline we're inevitably seeing with Biden, which is not, atypical of someone of his age.
No. And
it's not something, it's something the Democrats have obviously pushed under the carpet, but I think it's quite apparent from the number of interviews. They call them Joeisms and his gaffes, but there's too many of them for it to just be swept under the carpet and ignored as just like, it's just old age. But then again, this speaks back to, if it is old age, and even if it is, just forgetfulness,
yes,
then surely there are better candidates out there out of all of the possible Democratic candidates they had initially.
Yeah. I think you're certainly right. In the second debate, Trump actually, for once, I think for the most part, came across as a bit more eloquent, and he was more measured than usual. There were his usual outlandish and crazy comments. I think at one point which actually made me laugh, it was so ridiculous. At one point in the second debate, I think he said that he'd done more for African Americans or on par with Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I did hear that. I did see that bit. And
but yeah, you're right. And in terms of Biden, there was a lot of "come on, man" and umming and ahhing, and it seemed to be a lot of confusion. And I don't think that bodes well, when you're looking at your big judgment calls and running an economy as gargantuan as the US. I think that's incredibly worrying. So you're right. Both candidates here they're not ideal by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Trump, for one, has all the sophistication of a hog, and absolutely doesn't hold himself or conduct himself as a president should, in all facets and divisions of that role. And then Biden, on the other hand, like we've spoken about, the cognitive decline, I think, is apparent to all, other than, I suppose, someone who's just trying to plain deny it at this point. And what scares me, man, is that, look, this is 2020. He's supposed to be a president for the next 4 years. So I can't... The trajectory of that sort of condition, I'd call it a condition. I suppose it's early onset dementia, if not medium to late. Is only develops with time and isn't something that generally gets better.
No, I mean, the trajectory is not looking good for him. And that leads me to question, I'm sure voters are aware of that. And a lot of voters will always also come from the position of, pre-pandemic, the world didn't implode when Trump was elected. I mean, however grotesque and unpresidential as he is, the world didn't blow up. There wasn't a war with North Korea. And for the most part of the beginning of his leadership, at least, the economy was booming. It was a sort of a 17-year high. Not that that's fully attributed to him, but I think that it counts for something that it didn't completely tank.
Yeah, and I think this probably speaks to the limited power of a president of the United States. Although it's incredibly powerful, they are not obviously dictator powerful. They don't have those sorts of powers. And, Putin, of course, would say something along the lines of, I think he said something like, US presidents generally aren't very powerful people. And I suppose compared to him, then yes, that stands true. But I think it would be arrogant or sort of naive to think that the change of one president to another would make or impact and percolate all levels and divisions of society in every aspect, and would potentially, rock the very foundation of America. I think they aren't powerful enough to do that, because there are mechanisms in place, and it's a democracy fundamentally, and there's a Senate where things and bills and ideas need to be passed before being implemented, which is correct, right? Because it just ensures that the pendulum doesn't swing too extremely one way or the other, and is moderated by a Senate.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up, Brotherly Bear. This is actually the next area I wanted to focus on, particularly the role of the Supreme Court. I mean, you're bang on right. The checks and balances that are placed on the president actually make them, as democracies go, fairly weak in terms of the stretch of their influence on the country domestically. But you've got the role of federalism, so you've got all the states' rights and the states' legal systems that in many ways override the federal government.
Federal law.
Federal! But you've also got the role of the Supreme Court, and I think this is really where Trump's legacy is. Because in the past 4 years, Trump has appointed 3 very conservative Supreme Court justices, and now we're looking at a 6-3 conservative majority on the most supreme and top U.S. judicial body. It was huge news when he appointed Amy Coney Barrett, which I think she was administered the oath of office. I think it was 1 day ago or 2 days ago now. So right in there before the election. Amy Coney Barrett is a huge social conservative on issues like abortion, gay marriage, gun laws, even the Affordable Care Act. So really with Amy Coney Barrett, we're going to be seeing a lasting legacy. It doesn't matter if Biden wins by a landslide. She's probably going to work towards repealing Obamacare, or influencing that. And you've also got her influence on repealing Roe versus Wade, which is the federal abortion law back, I believe, in 1973. So these are long-term, long-lasting impacts of the Trump presidency that could be with us for like 20, 30, 40 years. And obviously, Trump also picked the justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, which completely tilted the balance towards conservatism in the Supreme Court. So again, it goes so much further than the office of the president and so much further than Donald Trump himself in terms of the legacy.
So what are the checks and balances in place or the hurdles rather he has to overcome to implement these judges and justices?
Very little. Basically, the way and this is why.
So why hasn't this been a strategy of governments past, or has it been, and they've just not done it as successfully?
So there's two reasons for that. The first, and it's a really good question. The first one is that chief justices are there to stay. Not chief justices, justices in the Supreme Court. So there's 9 justices, and basically they're there until they either resign, which they very rarely do, or they die. So it's not a democratic position at all, and they're directly appointed by the president. So really, we had a string of deaths. I mean, recently you had Scalia that passed away, but you also had recently Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a huge liberal icon and liberal influence in the Supreme Court. Her passing away left the door open for Trump to appoint Coney Barrett. So again, it's not democratic. The other reason why this mechanism hasn't been used so politically is because the Supreme Court, I guess the only parallel would be the British monarchy, is seen as this sort of supremely neutral body that is above all politics, or at least it was until the Bush administration. It was only until around that period onwards that justices would be appointed as a sort of device for presidents to influence and systematically enact their own beliefs. Before then, in some ways, you could say the American judicial system was less dirty. You'd have conservative justices voting for liberal ideas, liberal justices voting for conservative ideas, and they would generally be governed more by the Constitution than by party politics, which is how it should be.
So these justices, these 9 justices, and using their powers as a mechanism for political influence, or a medium for political influence, is something that I suppose a combination of luck and strategic foresight through the Trump administration has sort of allowed for a more conservative justice board, which is comprised of 9 judges, if I understood you correctly, right? And he's appointed how many now? Additional in the slots that became available?
He's appointed 3.
3. So that's skewed the sort of political leanings of that board, I suppose.
Yeah, it has, because now 6 of the 9 justices are very conservative. Wow. In particular, Justice Clarence Thomas. He's a extremely conservative Supreme Court justice, and I think it's one of those things that's really made the liberals and the Democrats in general very angry, and in particular it's because a lot of them feel that the Supreme Court should be decided by the winner of the election, as in the next appointment. But as Mitch McConnell put, which I agree with him on, if the shoe was on the other foot, they wouldn't be saying that. Yeah,
of course. It seems like quite a novel tactic, or even a way of implementing political leanings.
So it's novel in the sense it's novel in the past 20 years. Prior to that, Clinton,
but as a
Reagan,
strategy of influence, I suppose, or a medium of influence, it's quite. Yes. I suppose the opportunity to do as such comes few and far between, because, as you say, they typically serve for life. So that's really just coincided with the Trump administration, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, to put it into perspective, the Supreme Court gives the final word on highly contentious laws. It gives the final word on disputes between the states and the feds, and really, it hears fewer than 100 cases a year, but the fact of the matter is, with this new appointment of Barrett, we could be looking at whoever wins the election, irrespective of who wins. The 1973 decision to legalize abortion, that could be overruled. Obama's Affordable Care Act and the 20 million Americans that ensures, that could also be overruled.
So that was what I was going to ask you. Like, it sounds like the Supreme Court's powers are quite far-reaching and have the ability to almost veto, overrule anything that the Senate passes, or does it cross their desk and they typically, like the monarchy, kind of just put a tick in the box? Or in theory, do they have the power to veto it and block it?
So in terms of how they enact power and change, it's less so with the Senate. That would generally be breaching the separation of powers that's heralded as a benchmark of American democracy. It would be more to do with certain states bringing up hearings or grouping together to bring up hearings, even individuals, corporations, or other aspects of the federal government that would want to put forward a change. They will look into it and they will calibrate that in line with the US Constitution. So the Supreme Court's job, above all, is to interpret the US Constitution and decide and decipher, basically, how it matches up or conflicts with modern day changes. So that's generally how they do it. And for a lot, that's scary because Coney Barrett is an originalist, which means she interprets the US Constitution as the authors intended, not moving with the time.
Right, so ultra-conservative, like you said.
Conservative in the true sense of the word. And that's, to a lot of liberals, that's very scary. Because, again, depending on the president, it's almost irrelevant. They can enact those changes.
Wow. So
in fact, the Supreme Court decided on who won the Bush-Gore election. Do you remember when that was all contested?
Right, because the margin was so slim.
The margin was slim. There were issues about the vote counting in Florida. There was a lot of, even on the top levels of the federal government, I believe there was a lot of discrepancy in people's opinions on who the winner was. So I think, that's when the court stepped in and it ruled that Bush was the winner.
Right. Okay. And I suppose it's impossible to completely disregard or take out of the equation any political leanings in that board of 9 justices.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a time when there was a time when whatever your political leaning that you held in the Supreme Court, your job was to interpret the Constitution. It was not to enact your belief system. And Clarence Thomas did a great job of doing that. He's a very conservative man. He's an African American who grew up in, I think it was Georgia or South Carolina. And he grew up obviously in a terrible time of segregation, where also there was very little help for the the working person in America in the 60s. And he basically, I think he grew up in an area where the only route to education was just spending time in his local library. And he's very much a exemplar of the American dream. So, African American from a poor background who grew to be one of the most powerful men in America. And he actually administered the oath of Coney Barrett 2 days ago. Wow.
Okay. So I've definitely not seen the intricacies or ever appreciated the power of the Supreme Court. I've never really taken the time to understand it in any level of depth. So this is really insightful stuff. And it sounds like you're keeping on top of all of these changes because, like you say, with these new 3 Chief Justices, the impacts of this and repercussions of this will be felt for decades to come.
Absolutely. I mean, people forget how powerful the judiciary branch of the US government is. That being said, internationally, the US Supreme Court research has shown that it's generally diminishing in its global influence. And funnily enough, I think that the more conservative it gets, that seems to be a catalyst. Court systems elsewhere in the world have developed more of a sort of front and center use for sort of the yardstick. So one would be the European Court of Human Rights. There's other national Supreme Courts. There's aspects of the UN. But in terms of internationally, the US influence of their court, at least, not their economy, but their Supreme Court, has generally been waning. And I think, I mean, my personal opinion is that a lot of this is because of the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was under Trump's initiative. Other things you could take into account were perhaps a controversial travel ban. These kind of things that affect millions of people worldwide, I think, have cemented a gradual diminishing of the US Supreme Court's global influence.
Right. Okay.
But in America, it's
domestically,
huge.
Yeah. It's all very big. And Leo, how do you see the whole, I suppose, phenomenon of populism playing out over the next election, depending on who gets picked? Because I suppose populism is a term that's been thrown around quite liberally over the past few years. But from my understanding, it's sort of a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people. If I look at the definition of it, ordinary people who feel feel disenfranchised or disregarded by the established elite groups. But you could argue that that's sort of the aim of any potential presidential candidate, to appeal to that group of ordinary people, and I'm doing it for the people. So I suppose it's not a particularly new phenomenon. Maybe it's just been labelled or given a new label as populism. Or has this actually been a term that's been around for a long time? It's just risen to prominence more recently, sort of the 1%, 99%, and the Occupy Wall Street and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think populism is such a sort of slippery and vague concept.
Yeah.
And it's led to centrist movements. It's led to fascism. It's led to communism. Generally, populism loosely is defined by a set of initiatives. I'm not even going to say ideas, because populism isn't an ideology. It's not based on, say, everyone being equal, or it's not based on, a low tax economy or any particular static belief or ethos. It's really based on the general public rising up and becoming more powerful than the elites.
So is it almost sometimes a precursor to revolution, or is that?
It can be. Yeah, it certainly can be. I think more than often, populist movements, we saw that in Germany after the Weimar Republic. I mean, the initial sort of essence of Hitler's party being elected democratically to the Reichstag started as a populist movement, and it was a movement that saw a confluence of socialist ideas in terms of how we handle healthcare and infrastructure, with very socially conservative ideas about race and nationhood. And these ideas at the time evoked people in the sort of bourgeois high ranks of society, but also craftspeople and blue-collar workers and people who work 12 hours a day in factories. And I think in a sense that defines populism. It's something that unites across class and even across race a lot of the time, although not in the case of Germany, of course, but in other instances it has done. And that's led to a figure or a government, and in this case we're faced with the Trump administration, that is completely different from previous conceptions of what constitutes conservatism or liberalism. And a lot of people will put, rightly so, Trump in the conservative camp, but his variant of politics, or doing business in politics, it isn't even conservative. It's, there's aspects of it that are quite socialist. There's aspects of it that are very anti-interventionist, that would be tied more to the Democratic Party traditionally. There's aspects of it that are highly conservative, such as aspects of his immigration policy and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's such a mishmash of hard to define ideas that I guess we do put it in the populist camp, because that's the only place it can go.
Right, because it's the only category vague enough to allow for it, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, we'll go through a little detail, the Trump presidency over the past 4 years. We'll glaze over a few of the changes happened a bit later on the podcast, but they're zigzagging all around in terms of the where their bearings would be on the political spectrum.
Yeah, it's all over the shop. Kind of, there's no one true north, and the moment you think you've got them pinned down, then it's something completely unexpected jumps out as a initiative or idea. I've noticed that with the candidates, obviously Trump is an extreme, but not necessarily far right candidate, or someone or akin to a more extreme conservative ideal. And I suppose if you had Bernie, then that would be the antithesis of that. And maybe that would be a more representative, or two more representative candidates that would represent the two spheres of opinion and worldview that we're seeing in a dividing line, and that dividing line being ever more prevalent globally in terms of left-right. And, we're seeing the consequences of that, one of them being, of course, the Trump election, Brexit, all of these things. And I think even in Poland, there's more dynamics around the far right and the far left, and those two views and those parties being ever more divergent, and therefore the population and the people who would follow each of those respective parties diverging ever more, and probably leading to more clashes, which is what we're seeing now. And I just wonder whether that division of left and right, and the ever more divisive world we're seeing, is a division along generational lines. And if it is along generational lines, a bit like we saw with Brexit, what determines that division? Can we sort of pinpoint a year or a decade? Was it even something like an event, such as the advent of the internet? I'm not sure.
There's such a broad question, and I think it's so hard to pin that down and even measure that. I'm sure that the echo chamber effect and the mechanisms behind social media and all of its algorithms have created greater division than ever. I think generation has a lot to play in it. People's aspirations to travel and live and work abroad and make their impact globally and sort of see themselves as citizens of the world, that's very much attributed to the younger generation. You've got the older individuals that perhaps more settled, and their aspirations are more about democracy and sovereignty, and staying in one location geographically, but actually having a lot more scope in terms of deciding their own future, and having power over politicians, treating politicians as employees. That seems to be more of a facet of the older generation. But coming back to what we were just saying, Brother Bear, I'd love to hear your opinion on where you might put Mr. Trump in terms of his placement on the political spectrum. You're an articulate man, Andre. Where would you see him as fitting, if anywhere?
I think you summed it up really well earlier on when you said he doesn't fit neatly in one box or the other as to either liberal or right-wing. Obviously, he sits within the Republican camp, so he is a right-wing person predominantly. But you're right, there are certain policies and acts brought in under his administration that been sort of atypical of maybe a Republican government, and you could almost call it as his own brand of Republicanism or Trumpism even, because it's so unique and not akin to anything we've really seen up until now. And I suppose it was to be expected, given what a nuanced candidate he was in the first place, someone completely outside of the establishment, and he was up against the establishment, and I suppose it gauged the mood of America at the time, which was very anti-establishment, which was everything that the Clintons represented and continue to represent. But as to where he sits on the political spectrum, I think I've probably not seen or been interested in, even from a distance, having our own troubles with Brexit. I've probably just not had the bandwidth to look at the acts and policies he's pushed through the Senate. But I know he's been an awful lot more effective than Obama in passing through what he's tried to, because of the Republican majority. And I think at first, where maybe the Republicans cringed at the thought of Trump as their one and only candidate and later president, they've sort of come to almost embrace him and realize that there is a strength to Trump, as flawed and sort of abhorrent of a person as he is at times.
Well, in terms of his, as you say, his effectiveness, he's not messed about, and I think he's someone that's had a life in the private sector and as a very visual TV oriented celebrity. Why wouldn't he go out of his way to make the largest impact? So you're absolutely right there, Andre. I think that the effectiveness is the word there. I mean, you look at his legacy, not even considering the Supreme Court. He's completely revamped the immigration system. He's made huge strides towards repealing Obamacare. A lot of people don't actually recognize as well that he's removed a hell of a lot of troops from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. That's something that's really not looked at, and he did say he was going to do that. He said he was going to bring people home from pointless wars. He has maintained a presence over there, particularly surrounding the oil interests the US has in the Middle East, but he's reduced a hell of a lot of troops, and his tax cuts are also a major aspect of sort of the Trump bump that we've seen pre-pandemic. He slashed taxes for the rich and the poor, introduced tax credits for families with children, doubled it even, and brought in a standard deduction for individuals who did not itemize their tax returns. So really, I remember working over in America when this came in, and people were like, wow, I've got an extra $200 a month. So this is the significant, that's someone's groceries, the significant changes to people in all stratas of society. And there's other measures as well. I mean, on the sort of macro level, the gross domestic product and employment levels hit highest on a 17-year average. So we're seeing booms that hadn't been evident since the dot-com bubble. Now, of course, a lot of these glowing numbers did represent a continuation of the trend lines that began during the Obama administration, which I think the majority of Americans do recognize, or hopefully recognize. But so saying that, it was continued and it was boosted under Trump, and that does count for something that cannot be completely dismissed. Yeah,
I think it's right that you acknowledge sort of his successes and promises held where due. So there are positives, no doubt. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the jobs as well, and bringing as many of those manufacturing jobs back to the United States, where they'd previously been outsourced over the last 2 decades. And I think that's a trend we're seeing globally, particularly sort of superimposed or maybe writ large with the America-China divorce, in terms of the level of outsourcing going on there being discouraged by the government, as much as corporations would want to continue with that strategy, because it's a profitable one, albeit less profitable than it was back in the 90s and early 2000s. but I think that's generally, unfortunately, goes against sort of the globalist utopia maybe I saw, where there was be ever more routes and channels of international cooperation on the technological fronts, on labour fronts, and just sort of a more of a footloose approach in every aspect of national economies, where they have the ability and even incentive to be pushing employment out elsewhere, and it would ultimately benefit everyone, because wherever you'd have outsourced labour, there would also be labour which you are highly specialised in domestically, and therefore other countries, or maybe that very country you outsource to, would also seek out such specialised labour. So I think that, unfortunately, that dream or a step towards that world has taken a step back with sort of a bit of a more insular nationalistic approach, both unilaterally between China and America, and you're kind of seeing that writ large with the 5G technology and sort of the distancing from Huawei under suspicions of security issues. And I think in the UK as well, we recently passed in Parliament the idea that Huawei wasn't going to be implemented in the UK from a 5G perspective. We're going to go with other vendors such as, I think, Ericsson or Samsung.
Yeah, that sort of skepticism and distancing from China, and I'd imagine that's been exacerbated by the pandemic from a lot of countries. There are certain prejudices there that have come from that. But you're definitely right that the Trump administration has led to a overwhelming step back from unrelenting internationalism. I mean, this is a guy that came in and said America first, and in many ways he's stuck to his word on that. I mean, as soon as he came in, really, he gave final approval to several long-delayed oil pipelines over vast swathes of Alaskan wilderness to open up new oil and gas drilling projects. And I think that another thing which is very alarming to look at is his environmental record. I mean, he's gutted the EPA. He has really permitted most of the US coastline, aside from Florida, to be explored for fossil fuel. He's really accelerated that. You've also got, obviously, the pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which harked back to the Obama era.
At the beginning, wasn't it?
That was right. Yeah, that was right at the start. And all of these taboos, whether it's, not building oil pipelines, to not developing, a sufficient environmental protection initiative, to the international agreements whereby countries are trying to reduce their carbon emissions. These are all at odds with how America has been. So in a sense, Trump is in some ways the ultimate conservative on environmental fronts, because he has pulled out of all those areas and he's put America first. So he's very much stuck to that. But of course, on an international level, the consequences could be somewhat catastrophic.
Yeah, and I think just looking at it very holistically from a global perspective, it's disappointing that America's made that step backwards, because obviously they're a huge international player, arguably one of the biggest alongside China, in terms of the direction the globe takes over the next few decades. And so I think it's just a little bit of a shame, because I think it's an inevitable and in fact desirable outcome to strive for ever increasing international relationships on all levels and all stratas, whether that's societal or economic. And I think an increasing cross corporations is only a good thing. Obviously, minimize the damage done by globalization and brands, things like that. Obviously, we don't want to homogenize the world. I think that would be a disaster. But I think a very healthy level of international cooperation and cross-pollination is critical to accelerated development. One of the things I would congratulate Trump on, and I don't know whether he sort of did this inadvertently, didn't realize it was actually a positive thing, but it was just an increase, and quite marked increase in funding for NASA.
Yeah, that's really absolutely
cool.
right.
So the whole Launch America program, and obviously the first commercial launch with SpaceX of 2 astronauts, and I think that was very inspiring. And I'm so glad NASA is finally, after quite a few administrations, finally getting the funding it needs. Obviously still a way off what it was getting during the Kennedy era, during the space race, but getting back towards those levels, I think, would put America in very good stead. And I think globally we will stand to benefit as we look to the moon as a potentially shuttle base to further ventures and endeavors towards Mars, but also utilizing the moon as a potential resource for mining all sorts of minerals, potentially something like helium-3, which is a potential renewable energy resource. But yeah, I think that's quite a bit of forward thinking there from Trump, atypical of him, but good nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of, I'm sure it's motivated by an America First ideology, but it could have, implications internationally that would be very positive.
Yeah.
You mentioned helium-3. They're now looking into water resources on the moon.
Yes, indeed.
That's just yesterday, I think. So, and the first, I think is it the first female astronaut will be landing on the moon?
Yeah, I think they're shooting for 2024 with NASA for the first female astronaut, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So these sort of progressive changes are in the making, and I think Trump's approval of the American Space Agency to
the Space Force
further its funding.
He's also created the Space Force, right? Sorry to interrupt you.
What's the Space Force, Brother Bear? Tell me.
I don't know, but I'm sure he's put together a Space Force. And people were having quite a few laughs around the uniform for the Space Force, because obviously they will be in space, but it was like the traditional army, black, green, and dark green and brown camouflage.
That's so Trumpy to do that.
Yeah, well, it's the army, it's the force, it's gotta have it.
I think
logo looks like it's been hijacked directly from Star Trek.
That sounds a lot like Trump. I'm sure. Remember when he was landing in helicopters playing was it Air Force One, the Air Force One theme? He was doing that, and it's just like you couldn't make it up. Like the level of sort of Hollywood.
I know. The level of Hollywood. I mean, he's a showman at the heart of it. Really, that's not a surprise. He's come from show business. And he loves it, doesn't he? He loves the limelight, and he plays up to it. And you even saw that when he was diagnosed with COVID, when he went on that parade while he was in hospital.
Yeah, he was like waving from the car, wasn't he? And,
yeah,
it was incredible.
And then it was just pure cheese. But he came out when he arrived back at the White House after his visit in hospital. He went out onto the balcony and he put like a little YouTube video together of him waving and the American flag and the troops, and he was out there on the balcony waving at the crowds in front of the White House. And he said he felt invincible.
Well, I'm sure he did after recovery. Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. You sort of sit there with your head in your hands thinking,
it's tremendous.
How did we even get to this point? What the hell is going on? But yeah, I think for me, looking back at the past 4 years, and I remember it so vividly when Trump claimed the victory, I think the past 4 years, the saddest thing and the really unfortunate thing, and I think this isn't just social media, I think this is a reaction to the individual of Trump himself, is just the level of division in the United States has just been absolutely unprecedented.
Yeah, I think you're seeing that almost globally. Brexit's a symptom of that as well. I think you're seeing far right, far left dynamics play out all across the world, right? You see it in Germany, you've seen it in France, Pegida, all of that stuff. I think democracy by no means is perfect, but it has been said that it's probably the best system we've got. And indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for those other forms that we have tried from time to time.
Yeah. And, in its current state, it's been around for about a century.
Yeah.
and already it's under so much attack and skepticism, and it's quite sad. I mean, you look at the EU and you look at the US, and there's so little faith in these systems now.
Yeah.
I mean, already they're looking into Russian interference into this election. And there's, I think, different arms of federal law enforcement are looking into that. And you just think, it's so sad, isn't it? And, you know, you've got the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal as well. And I think that it's a shame that, you know, this system that has been around in its current state around 100 years, people are just so skeptical about it.
I think, yeah, they are incredibly skeptical. And I think almost if you really boil it down to the root cause, I theorize it might be to do with the brain's wetware incompatibility to keep up with the level of data being churned out by hardware silicon. I literally think our brains aren't able to process enough data and are just getting almost jumbled in the static, the sort of the deafening static of information. And so all of this polarization, extremism, tribalism is what we fall back on as default as humans, and as a reaction, a coping mechanism even, to the sort of the incalculable and overwhelming complex reality of sort of social dynamics and the full nuanced spectrum of opinions that arises from those social dynamics. And I think we're unable to compute all of that, and from that we fall back on simpler ideals or simple tribalism, whether you're in one camp or the other, and if you're not with us then you're against us. And this is the sort of sickening reality we find ourselves in a little bit now.
That's a great point. That's a really great point, Brotherly Bear. I think it's the amount of data, the volume, and the level of distortion drives us back to what we know and what we love, that nostalgia, that sort of tribal nostalgia.
Yeah.
It
crashes your wetware, it crashes your brain, and you just fall back on you fall back on instinct.
That's right. Yeah, you fall back on your instinct and what you know, and the groups that you grew up with. And, you know, you have vivid imagery of your hometown and what people believe back there. And I think that's what a lot of people fall back on in these times. And that's sadly, that's pushing people even further apart. Yeah,
definitely. And I think there's a lot of duality. There's no third party. There's no Lib Dems anymore. Notice that. It's just Democrats, Republicans. It's just Conservative. It's just Labour. We're only talking about those two. How weird is it that the Lib Dems and the Greens have suddenly become a distant memory?
Yeah, I feel like there was a time not so long ago where politics was far less binary.
Yeah.
And far less tribal. You know, and you'd have people, you know, you wouldn't encounter people demanding, are you pro-gun or anti-gun, or are you pro-immigration or anti-immigration? You know, I feel like not so long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, things were quite a bit more nuanced, and there was more accommodations for, you know, a more diverse and nuanced conversation about each issue.
Yeah, and nuance was something to be celebrated and enjoyed, and I suppose the full spectrum of debate allowed for that. But now you've got this binary duality, which it really just is at headlogs, right? And it just generates unproductive, often nonsensical, I wouldn't even call it debate anymore, just sort of pure reaction and emotion. And when you bake emotion into it, then yeah, there's a lot of irrationality that arises out of that.
Yeah, a hell of a lot of irration. I think that's a great word to describe it, irrationality. Because wherever you are on the fence, left, right, centre, even whatever you believe in, if you see your views as the ultimate morality and will never ever allow any kind of other opinion or nuance to interfere with that belief system, the destination you'll arrive at can only be extremism.
Absolutely. And the moment you put yourself firmly in one camp or the other, and refuse to budge or refuse to moderate your ideas depending on what you hear and what you listen to, or even just people just close their ears to the idea of debate because I don't know why, but maybe they fear that their belief systems will collapse under the rigor of a debate. But that's what debate's for, and that's what moderation's for, and that's what moderates social behavior. If you go out and murder someone, then you go to court and go to jail for a very long time, and that's only right because that's what moderates action. But there's nothing to moderate ideas.
No, that's right. There's nothing to moderate ideas, and debate and nuance and self-awareness of one's own nuance in debate is all part of stress testing. Stress testing basically the robustness of your ideas. How much are they tied to facts? How much are they tied to statistics? How much are they tied to, memories, or the way you were raised, or your friendship group, or the people you work with? These are all the data points that need to be looked into and considered when you're really putting an idea or viewpoint forward.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it starts with introspection, like an forthright, honest introspection, whereby you're kind of it's a lot easier said than done, and it takes a lot of practice, and I struggle with it, and you struggle with it as perfect as you are, Brobear. It's an art you never stop working on. Sort of forthright confrontation with thy own beliefs is an ongoing, lifelong process, and it has to be done on a daily basis. Well, subconsciously most of the time, but it is done. It is done. But I think at first it needs to be a conscious action before becoming a subconscious thing. But some people never get there, or never even want to entertain the idea of consciously, internally testing their own ideas before then sort of spouting anything. And then once they do spout something, they're unwilling to test the strength and robustness of those ideas against someone else's, which I think is a real shame, because I thought that was sort of the cornerstone of democracy and sort of civil society.
Yeah, I feel like that should be the goal in people, in robust civic duties, and just having a good personal constitution. Just being an example of being a product of good governance would be, in my eyes, someone who is able to question their own beliefs and divorce themselves temporarily from their own ego, and not to just affirm and reaffirm and self-validate their viewpoints, however left or right wing they are. And I think that's the side of Donald Trump's presidency that's been the most ugly, is that I think Trump has actually made the left more extreme, and more nonsensical. And I think that in turn, you sort of, you're talking in sort of terms of cause and effect, the insanity of certain aspects of left-wing movements are pushing more good, honest, working people towards the sort of Trump voting inclination.
Yeah.
And I think as much as people on the left would hate to hear that or would deny that, I really believe that in essence, that's also what's feeding into Trump's power and prowess as a 2020 modern politician.
Yeah, definitely. A big part of that was obviously the whole cancel culture, which pervades until today. That's an ongoing problem where people feel offended for one reason or another, typically sort of unjustified in terms of the repercussions of things like people losing their jobs, over a stupid tweet. It's and more often than not, it's obviously not a justified action for someone to lose their employment because of a tweet that doesn't quite jive with someone's political leanings. So apart from the cancel culture, I think you've also just had the level of some college campuses and university campuses predominated by a political leaning, and I don't think university campuses should be leaning politically one way or the other. I think they should be melting pots of debate and not necessarily identify as either left or right.
Oh yeah, I mean, academia college campuses and being an academic should all be about self-exploration, and really trying to understand this thing we call society better, and where it works and where it doesn't work. It shouldn't be about, putting yourself in a particular camp. I mean, as soon as you join the ranks of the second year university crowd, you identify as perhaps a Marxist historian or a conservative geographer. Well, here's another idea. What about if you come in the best way you possibly can as a neutral party, and take different stances on different issues, and actually just treat it as sort of a ride, a roller coaster of different thoughts and debates, and then maybe at the end you can compile a belief system that you're certain about, but don't borrow in to those ideas with a built-in bias, because the results are always going to be the same.
Absolutely, yeah. And it goes back to sort of forthright checking of hypotheses and ideas, and being able to adjust them in light of new evidence, almost like the scientific method, right? Doing it that way. Because you look at examples globally, and you could look. Let's just go back to the left-right thing. The chances of the right being completely right or the left being completely right is just a flawed idea to start with, because neither has all the answers. The truth is the truth lies somewhere in between them. Whether it's more to the left or to the right, we can argue for millions of years, but the truth is that it lies somewhere between them. There is no way that the left has all the answers, and it's no way that the right has all the answers. So you look at somewhere like China, where they've sort of married sort of potentially the extremes of one and the other, and it's actually an incredibly successful country if you look at it. Look, it's got almost this element of dictatorship in Xi Jinping. You've also got the element of communism, obviously, in sort of state socialism, or almost a bit of a bastardized version of Marxism, as all socialism seems to be when implemented. And then you've got sort of rampant free market capitalism all in there, and it seems to work incredibly well all together, because you've kind of got enough power from the government to push and deregulate and reduce red tape where possible to allow the free markets to operate, but also regulate the society so it's not too disruptive when it comes to the ruling party and all of that. So you can argue for the human right records and all of that, and all of that's awful, but from a perspective sort of holistically, and maybe just looking at it economically for a second, it's a system where the cogs all kind of mesh quite nicely.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point, Brother Bear. You've got sort of a pick and mix approach to markets and freedoms and governance. And yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of China's economic might and its resilience in recessions, and also in certain aspects of how its middle class has been completely widened.
Well, lifted out poverty, the millions who lifted out poverty in China over the last 4 decades. It's incredible.
There's other parallels you can draw in sort of modern Germany as well, from the 80s, sort of post Berlin Wall coming down, the phenomenon of ordoliberalism, and the ordoliberalist political system is, and they have it to this day in Germany, it basically sees a board level confluence of unions, so labor unions, corporations, and the government coming together to sort of diplomatically achieve goals that are in line with working class interests, but also relatively free markets, and also social programs. And some people will say, well, that's impossible. You need to have free markets and low minimum wages and a low tax economy. Others will say, no, that's crazy. You need to have, a full socialist, fully nationalized, collectivized outcome. But ordoliberalism has very much formed a confluence of both of those disparate ideas, and it's pulled it off very successfully in the case of modern Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another example of where nuance is actually the way forward, and of course it is. Like, you're never going to have all of the answers in the right wing basket equally on the left. So
no,
I think we all know the answer is that it's somewhere in between the two, And maybe there's also a leaf to be taken, dare I say, from the dictator's book, and also a leaf to be taken from the Marxist manifesto. Like, why not? Because there is some value to be derived from all of these systems, and I think a confluence and a right concoction of all three can lead to a productive society. Obviously, you're never going to have a perfect society. No such thing exists, only in theory. But yeah, you're going to end up with a far better, well-rounded society than you would otherwise.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Well-rounded. And this is great because we're talking about electability here, and we're talking about sort of how representative governments and institutions are of the people they represent, in terms of the confluence of different views and ideas. And this brings me to the point of the Electoral College, and I really wanted to discuss that with you, Brother Bear, particularly in light of this election in a week's time. So
I'm a true layman here, so do help me out.
Well, that's fine. I think most people are laymen with the Electoral College. It seems to be structured so that no one can bloody understand it. But in essence, what it is it consists of 538 electors, and you need an absolute majority of 270 or more to win. So back in 2016, Trump got 306, Hillary got 232, but Hillary got 2.8 million more votes than Trump. So how do we work that one out?
Right. I think this is one of the big controversies, wasn't it? Because although on paper, obviously, more people had voted for Hillary, the Electoral College had swayed it in Trump's favor, right?
Yeah.
So how close was it? How many more or less Electoral College votes would Trump need for Hillary to get elected?
Well, Hillary had 232. She would have needed 270 to win. Trump had 306. So it was quite a big difference, which put some glaring holes in the fact that Hillary won the popular vote by such a huge margin. And that's what was so worrying about it, and that's why the polling system in America is useless, because if you're asking it person for person, it actually doesn't really indicate anything, because the Electoral College runs on a first past the post, winner takes all system. So let's take a state like California, which has 50, because of its huge population, it has 55 electoral votes out of the 538 in total. Now, let's say, what's half of 55 million? It would be, was it 27.5 million?
27.5, yeah.
So let's say one more person than 27.5 million voted Democrat over Republican, then all of the 55 votes in California would go to Democrat.
Oh, wow.
So it's not, so it's winner takes all.
So they take they take the state's population or votes, sorry.
So the number of electoral votes reflects the population. So Montana has 3 electoral votes. California has 55. Texas, I think, has something like 48. I may be wrong, but around that number.
Just proportional to the population of a given state.
Correct.
And what's the ratio?
I don't know what the formula they use is or how they
It'll
tweak
be like
it, but
1 million or something like that, right? Or whatever the ratio is.
Possibly, yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think it's that precise, because Montana, Wyoming, and I think South Dakota all have just 3. Their populations vary quite a bit. So it's quite confusing. But the fact of the matter is Trump won the battleground states on a very, very slim margin. So, and these are going to be the states that we'll need to be watching for next Tuesday. Michigan's, Pennsylvania's, Florida's a huge one, because Florida has 29 electoral votes.
Yeah.
So if say Trump wins that by one person's vote, those 29 will be given to Trump. So those are the states to watch. Nevada's another one. Wisconsin, I may have already said that, but these are the states to keep an eye out on. But the idea behind the Electoral College was really just to prevent the cities from strangling the rural areas and the smaller states, because you've got the sort of reverse issue in Canada where I am, where elections are really decided just by how people vote in Toronto and Montreal. Mm-hmm. Whereas all of Western Canada, where all the farming and the agriculture and the forestry and the oil and gas is, counts for nothing, diddly squat, just because there's less people there. So I can see it from the side of the Electoral College. Another good argument is that if you were to take California out, just the state of California, from the 2016 election, I think Trump would have won by something like 10 or 15 million votes. So it's unfair for a state just because of its population to dictate the outcome. So it's a very divisive issue, Brother Bear. What do you think?
Yeah, I can see how you can have a lot of controversy around this system. I think in the UK, I think any system you implement, there will inevitably be shortcomings and limitations to it. Because a rule, by definition, if you implement it, has an opportunity cost. So there's something you're foregoing by taking one rule or the other, and that's unavoidable. So I know I'm looking at it very holistically, and I'm not sort of addressing the specific examples you just mentioned, but yeah, it does seem a bit weird how one state such as California could swing it so drastically one way or the other. But I suppose on the other hand, it does make sense because it's proportional representation, in that the given population of a given state would be represented in equal weighting by the number of votes. So you just say California was 55, for example,
yeah,
which is relative to the other states extremely high, if not the highest. So I'm not sure I have enough knowledge on the system itself to have a strong opinion one way or the other. All I'm saying is sort of just giving a bit of generic insight there, and I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, to be honest. I don't even know enough about it myself to cast judgment on which system would be better. All I know is it's hugely controversial for someone to get almost 3 million votes more and lose the election by a landslide.
Yeah. Well, there's equally a lot of criticism thrown at the British system of voting. First past the post. Is that right?
Yes. First past the post.
First past the post. Postman Pat. No.
Yeah, there's a lot of criticism, isn't there, to the wastage of votes, as some people would say, in a non-PR system.
Post past the post.
Yes, yeah. What we can conclude from all this is that in light of this particular election, it should definitely be a priority for people to keep an eye on what Florida's doing, what Texas is doing as well. These are states with big electoral vote numbers. They have, in the recent polls, been reflected to be a bit on the fence. So these are the states that will decide who the next president is.
I can't wait, Brother Bear. Are you going to be staying up all night watching the results in the states come in live?
Live. Well, I don't know. Live from the Rocky Mountains. I don't think I have the bandwidth to stay up all night. I think.
Come on.
Pow! No, I think that the last 4 years has exhausted me so much that I would much prefer a good night's sleep. But I'll definitely be watching it till about midnight, where I suppose the indicators will be there.
Yep.
On who's the victor. Final concluding thoughts before we call it on this podcast, Brother Bear. Do you have any insight on who you think the victor will be?
Well, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would put it on Biden. Joe's my man. Go for it, Joe. I think on a personal note, I think I'd prefer to see Joe in the White House for all his shortcomings. I just think another 4 years of Trump maybe wouldn't be the best thing, particularly from a climate standpoint. And really, that's it.
I think I agree with you there. Here we are, Brother Bear. We're in an echo chamber together. But I think, I think for me, climate is a big issue, and immigration as well. I don't like to see people separated from their families, and I think that above all, it's just the level of division that Trump has brought with him, and maybe that existed already or it was in the making, but I think that he's such a polarizing person, and it's gotten to the point where it's just exhausting. He tweets something and this company or this aspect of the economy tanks or goes up, and I think Biden, for all his shortcomings and for all his potential cognitive decline, we need someone that's, I think America needs someone that's a bit more centrist. And
agreed.
You know me, Brother Bear. I love America. I love the American people. And my first years being there were under the Obama administration. And I think in the same way as under the Reagan administration, America just felt united and it felt free. And I kind of think that's come to a bit of a close with Trump, with everyone being at each other's throats.
Yep, agreed. That's certainly the sense I get across the pond, and it's everything you're telling me and Damien's telling me. So let's get a change of guard, and come a week's time, let's see democracy manifest.
This is democracy manifest.
Go Biden. Pow!
Pow! We'll call it there, Brotherly Bear. Till next time, have a healthy and safe week ahead.
Thank you. You too. Healthy and safe. Goodbye.
Pow!